So I'll say right up front, I usually don't put multiple affiliations on the slides. It's sort of never ending, once you get senior enough. But I have three, just to sort of highlight three roles I'll be talking to today. First of all, I'm director of Spatial, and I'll get into what that's about. And as Todd mentioned, I'm a fellow here in the IonE, and I'm also a professor in geography, society, and environment in the College of CLA. And today I want to talk about how spatial thinking can help solve environmental grand challenges. So first of all, spatial thinking, what's that about? There's lots of competing definitions and so on. For me, spatial thinking is research or teaching or service or, to be honest, just day-to-day activities where you account for patterns and processes in spatial characteristics. And so we can think about, say, location, distance, pattern, scale. We've been doing spatial thinking for pretty much forever, right? Here's a map from almost 3,000 years ago, and this is the Babylonian worldview, right? It's a series of clay tablets. And these maps are fascinating because they actually show Babylon and its relationships with other city-states at the time, trading relationships and war and conquest and so on, right? And so people have long taken into account sort of where they are in the world and how they relate to other entities. So we've been doing it for a long time. You could argue that sort of the modern era of spatial thinking started about 150 years ago or so. This is Dr. John Snow, who's often considered yeah, I know, John Snow, I get it. The first John Snow, let's say, who's often considered the father of public health. And John Snow's grand challenge as a physician in the mid-1800s was a cholera outbreak in London, 1854. It became known as the Broad Street cholera outbreak. And cholera was up there with fire in terms of its ability to empty cities, right? Hundreds of people were dying. But no one really knew what caused it. It's actually a waterborne illness, right? But this is pre-germ theory. Louis Pasteur didn't introduce the germ theory until 1861. And so at the time, people thought that cholera was caused by miasma, literally in the Latin, bad air, right? So you wear handkerchiefs and so on, but people were still dying. He's tasked with figuring this out, and so what he does is he applies spatial thinking. He's one of the first people to go and talk to the families of victims and track where all the deaths were and all the cases were. So he's getting into location. He starts to ask questions that involve distance, right? How far apart are these victims? What are sort of features of the built environment? How far are they away from those? He starts to notice patterns. And this is a blow-up, right? This is a London-wide epidemic, but he starts to notice spatial clustering, a pattern in the appearance of cases. And there appears to be a lot more people in this part of London than other parts. But then he factors in other things. There's a monastery right there where no one's getting sick, right? Maybe it's because they're godly people. No one's quite sure. There's a family further afield that gets struck down. Right, and it turns out that the water, they actually like the water from this part of town, so they send their servants out to get that. He starts to put it together. The monks are drinking beer, they're not drinking water, right? There's a reason why people wanted to be a monk back then, right? So he starts to form this sort of working hypothesis. Maybe it has to do with the water. So he plots the locations of the pumps, and then he discovers one pump in particular seems to be the epicenter for this epidemic. Right, and again, he doesn't know why. He just knows something's going on. So he actually convinces the city fathers over a lot of opposition to lock up this one pump right here on Broad Street. And lo and behold, the cholera outbreak ends. Right, and there may have been other reasons for that, but this is one of the first times people applied spatial thinking to this kind of problem, and it kicked off a whole sort of research field after that. So here we are today, and the thing about spatial thinking today is it's merged with technology, like so many things we do, right? So now we use spatial thinking coupled with information systems for spatial data capture and management, analysis, visualization, and collaboration. And one of the overriding metaphors we use is the idea of a computer system that can keep track of digital maps, right? And you can stack these maps up so that they share locations and so on, and start to ask all the core sort of ideas, where are things located, how is distance entered into the picture, what patterns are at work, and so on down the line. And spatial thinking is going bonkers right now. That would be the technical term, bonkers. Spatial technology on its own it's a $1 trillion industry. It's poised to join nanotechnology and biotech as one of the 3 big industries of the next century, and that's what a lot of reports have come out with. It's driven by advances in data collection. Every one of us, I'm willing to bet in this room, or almost every one of us has a cell phone on their person. Your cell phones track your location and all your habits and so on, right? We're getting data from satellites, reams and reams of it. We've seen advances in computing, right? Your average cell phone now has a processor and memory capacity far greater than a supercomputer had 20 years ago, right? $200 or whatever. Networking, right? The advent of mobile computing, the advent of getting data from across the world in an instant. And so this is why companies like Facebook and Google are spending literally billions of dollars increasing their spatial databases, developing these spatial data algorithms, and so on. Most of these companies, they do the things they do for good reasons. They also do it to make a ton of money, most of it through search and advertising. Local search, or search that's tied to your location, is predicted to be about 80% of their revenue streams in the coming years, right? So Facebook and Google want to know exactly where you are. Apple's in the same boat. You could argue a company like Uber, this ride-sharing company, wouldn't exist without spatial technologies, right? The ability to locate you in space and develop routing and that kind of stuff. So it's a really, really big deal. And in academia, right, it's a big deal as well, right? And this is where you see spatial thinking, this sort of third version from mapping to spatial analysis to where we are now. It's a priority area for the federal funding agencies. There's plenty of calls now that are actually explicitly spatial or want to use spatial approaches to solve all sorts of problems. You're seeing calls in all the high-profile journals for spatial research. You're seeing the growth of spatial science and GIS, or Geographic Information Science Centers, right? There's been about a dozen universities, Harvard and Brown and USC, North Carolina, all these different places are establishing centers for spatial science and analysis. They're all focused on sort of spatial thinking broadly conceived. And it pervades many disciplines. Just for fun, every once in a while, I like to go through the various departments here at the university and see which ones are doing spatial work. And it's pretty much all of them. It's hard to find a single department that doesn't have 1 or 2 people engaging in spatial work. Astrophysics in their models, very sophisticated models of how nebulae form. Art, this is Lynn Lucas, 10 years ago was using GPS technology and mapping to situate her performance art. Looking at the military background, the GPS and so on. It's fascinating. Anthropologists for hundreds of years have been mapping their archaeological digs. I've got students who use fancy laser 3D mapping in their work. All the way down to zoology. And I'll put a little asterisk there. There's actually no more department of zoology. It's actually EEB now, but I needed a Z. So I can go from my department, A to Z. So you've got Craig Packer, who's in the news right now, and he uses all sorts of spatial thinking, mapping technologies to look at what lines are doing, and so on. There's plenty of research centers on campus. There's probably 100, this is just a smattering that have either people doing spatial work or explicitly spatially focused. We'll talk about a few of these later. And we also have USpatial, and I mentioned that I'm the new director of USpatial. This is a 5-year project in its 5th year to provide spatial science infrastructure on campus. It was funded by OVPR, along with contributions from about a dozen colleges and units on campus, CVANs and libraries and so on down the line. Some small part of that funding goes towards what we call the central core. And the central core is a small group of people, basically myself serving as a volunteer faculty director, Lynn Knie, who's in the back of the room now, and Green here, who's a full-time employee, a spatial guru. And then we have a team of research assistants, part-time RAs in the MGIS and the PhD and other programs who help do a lot of the work. And these good folks provide a help desk service, lots of training, workshops, infrastructure provision. We also do a fair amount of consulting with all comers, right? And here we're focusing on the basic characteristics of spatial thinking, getting at the data, the analysis, the visualization, the collaboration. I will note that it's a fairly, let's say, nimble organization, right? Which is another way of saying we don't have a ton of money for the central core. Like I mentioned before, there's many universities in the US and abroad that are developing freestanding research institutes in the spatial science. But we do quite well with what we have. And I think one reason is because we have excellent collaborations with folks all around campus, and I'll be talking about that. Just a few numbers of interest. We handled in the last 3-4 years almost 1,500 help desk calls. These range from 10-minute phone consultations to multi-day projects where we help people. We've had almost 1,500 people attend our workshops. These are often 20, 30 people, so we've had a number of these ranging from basic topics like how to map to really sophisticated ones. Another one here, we have almost 1,400 people on the mailing list, right? When we started this 5 years ago, I figured there was maybe 80, 100 people on campus that thought about spatial things. And now we're up to 1,400 and the number's growing, right? I used to think I know everyone. That's clearly not the case. The most important number right here in the middle, the number of colleges who have not worked with us, or another way of saying this, we've worked with every single college on campus, many units. Well over half the departments on campus we've had some kind of contact with. So, plenty of people doing spatial stuff, and that's really important because we have a lot of grand challenges we need to wrestle with here at U. By way of background, this grand challenges framework is part of the strategic repositioning that the university is doing right now, trying to identify areas where they want to invest time and resources. We have 3 existing grand challenges right now that have been identified. I won't read these, you can do that. And then we have a committee who requested proposals for new grand challenges. I think they got like 130 different proposals, and now they have 5 themes, and they're collecting input on these themes in order to craft a few new grand challenges. Again, I won't read through this, but in some ways it's no surprise, right? We as an institution are interested in making sure that humans and the environment will stay healthy and resilient and sustainable well into the future. That's where a lot of this sort of boils down. These are big grand challenges, right? There's no easy answers here, but luckily we got all these people using spatial thinking to deal with these sort of topics. So what I want to do with the remainder of the day here is, or this talk rather, is look at 4 areas of work. They're very IonE centric, because I'm talking here. Again, if there's say 1,400 odd people on campus doing spatial work, and I say at least half of those are doing it on a day-to-day basis, I'm clearly not going to get more than say 1 or 2% of the projects here, right? So my apologies to the folks I'm not talking about today. Again, this is just a sampling. So first of all, I want to talk about the view from above. One thing that's remaking spatial thinking right now is the ready availability of high quality data. Basically, we're taking pictures from space or from airplanes or from aerial drones, balloons, a whole array of platforms. The Polar Geospatial Center was one of the early leaders in this area. The PGC helped U-Spatial and University in general wrangle a $50 million grant from a private sector company called Digital Globe to get their entire digital archives. And this joins a slew of other publicly available data. This stuff is amazing, right? This stuff is sort of spy satellite territory in that you can pick out itty-bitty things down the ground. We're getting sub-meter now in terms of the ability to pick stuff out. And so, here's a resupply vessel at McMurdo down in Antarctica, right? And you're picking up buildings and cars, the gantries on the ships. It's amazing. You can do wonderful things. You can pick out, wrinkles in the ice on a glacier with these sort of data. One other thing you can do is count emperor penguins, right? I find this fascinating. Basically you're looking at penguins from space, and right? Because normally, I don't know what you do as a wildlife biologist, like wear a tuxedo and walk around and introduce yourself to penguins. There's other ways of doing this. They're not as efficient, right? So you basically can see penguin colonies from space Any guesses on what all this is? It's poop. That's right. It's okay. We don't say feces. It's penguin poop, right? Which is a great way of counting penguins because they're leaving this sort of browny, pinky paste everywhere. And this is fascinating because this work essentially used spatial thinking to double our estimates of emperor penguins, right? So a fundamentally new way of looking at the world. Another long-standing body of work here has been done in CFANS, the RSGAL, or Remote Sensing Geospatial Analysis Lab, and then more recently the Knight Geospatial Science Group. This is Mara Bauer, Joe Knight, and a few other folks who are using remotely sensed imagery to take the long-term pulse of nature in Minnesota and elsewhere. They're doing wetland monitoring. They are tracking the growth and change in impervious surfaces in cities, right? And this is one of the key contributors to sedimentation and water flow and so on. The water hits the ground, hits concrete, it goes elsewhere. And then you can't see it here, it's being locked off there, but this is the University of Minnesota lake browser, which lets sort of anyone go online and sort of see lake quality for where they live or elsewhere. And again, this is all using remotely sensed imagery, some ground-based studies, and then running it through very sophisticated spatial analysis. Another thing that this group is doing is using LiDAR data. I won't get technical here because I don't even know if I understand it. But LiDAR is using basically lasers from an airplane to measure elevation. They take millions of pulses of laser light collected and bounced back. And what it does is it gives you sort of centimeter scale elevation measures. And so, for instance, this was is a construction site on campus, and you can actually pick out the cranes and the gantries, right? That's how precise you can get. You can pick out multiple levels of, say, story in undercover in forests. And so one thing that we did with these data, and this is Len Kinney and a student group, a class project, they basically used all this incredible elevation data, and they combined it with a few other kinds of spatial data to create a map of Minnesota, of the solar potential, right? Lots of people are interested in putting solar panels in their house and so on. One of the trickiest things is deciding where to put those panels, right? And so now we have this easy app and a website where you can plug in your location or address, and it'll tell you over the course of the year what your sort of predicted solar potential is, right? And this actually went on to receive awards and so on. It's cutting edge stuff. And so again, using this sort of view from above, this view from space to sort of tell you things about the ground. In keeping with this idea of the view from above, you can't open the paper now without reading about drones, right? Amazon's going to be delivering packages and burritos and all these kind of good things with these robotic flying things. We have IonE fellow Volkan Eisler working with drones on all sorts of projects on sustainability things, right? Some of them are aerial, right? And so here he's got students that are working on farms. They can also be boats, right? I think when the robot apocalypse comes, you want to make sure you're in the lab with Vulcan and not out there. You've got University of Minnesota Extension Services using drones on farms to monitor soil quality, AV infestations, and so on, right? It's magical stuff. So you got the view from above. You've also got spatial thinking for collaboration, and this is the second area I'd like to talk about. The nice thing about spatial thinking in the modern era is now we have computers and networking. It's really easy to collaborate, right? You could always have drawn a map, but now you can do a lot of interesting real-time stuff, and you can also do things remotely, right? And so here you've got Karen Manson and Madeline Carr in School of Nursing, and they worked with Spatial to develop a Ebola response mapping, right? And a year and a half ago, we had this big Ebola outbreak. And just as we saw in other situations, like in Thailand with the tsunami or with Haiti and the earthquake, very often these places are struck by these disasters, and we have very little good, up-to-date intelligence on just where stuff is, right? And so, the commercial imagery at the time often was very out of date or had cloud cover and so on. So we used our fancy pants new imagery to come up with up-to-date, high-quality, high-resolution digital photos from space, images, and then we developed applications with nursing so that people could basically crowdsource a map. And so you could have students in a class take apart this image and start to draw roads and houses and so on and help plan responses. And then people in the field with internet access could update these in real time as necessary. So you have a collaboration engine here with spatial thinking. We have a lot of work on campus going on with the spatial data discovery and access, and so this is led by the libraries and a few other groups around this, where we're making it easier for researchers to share their information with other researchers, with members of the public. And then you can do fun things like Ryan Matki, the head of the MAP library, helped develop a campus history project. So this is an online resource where you can basically kind of go back and forth in time and sort of see what the university looked like in various points. Again, helping researchers and others collaborate. Geodesign is one of my favorite examples of a collaboration example for spatial thinking. And I see that Nick Jordan's in the back of the room now. Welcome. A number of IE fellows, Nick among them, are working with a few other folks like Dave Mull and Dave Pitt across several colleges, and they're trying to tackle this question of how do you create sustainable landscapes. In essence, and this is something the IonE is intrinsically interested in. How do we continue to have agriculture create food and fiber and fuel in a way that preserves ecosystem services, right? Or things like clean water or recreation or habitat, or beyond just livelihoods in say, rural America. This is a very complicated problem, right? It'd be one thing if researchers, all the bright people here, could simply go out into the world and say, you need to grow this here so that these good things will result. But of course, it's not that easy, right? It's a very complex system. You have plenty of stakeholders that are operating there. What you need to do is get out in the world, and you need to use geodesign or spatial thinking for design. So how do you do that? Well, if you're working with Spatial, what you do is you get 5 55-inch flat screen, touch screen, basically fancy TVs that allow you to draw on them. You get a server, some networking. You make it sort of portable, as in, truck portable. Luckily, the university has lots of trucks. Or if you're landing one of our RAs, you can actually sort of drag these things across the bridge as necessary. But this is in comparison to the few others, what they're called decision labs out there that are housed in buildings. You need to have people come to you. We can go to the people. So we can go to a senior citizen center in St. Peter, for instance, right, and talk to members of the public and farmers and so on about how they would like to design their landscapes. You draw your landscapes on these touch screens. They get rendered into a digital map. And then you talk about these designs, and then you get instant feedback, right? This is where all the magic happens, where these maps are tied to spatial models that give you, say, rates of sedimentation or carbon sequestration, or whether you'd make money off of your idealized landscape. And then you can say, use this information, go right back to the drawing board, where the drawing board is this big digital screen that gives you this feedback. And this work is sort of forming the basis for all sorts of interesting projects now on campus, right? So it's really got legs. The third area I want to talk about, it's very IonE focused, is spatial big data. Now, again, big data is sort of like spatial thinking. There's a fair amount of discussion about what it means. Basically, it means we have a huge amount of new types of data at our disposal right now. And so when a company like Amazon or Netflix, for instance, gives you recommendations of what you want to buy or see, for instance, they don't really know about you, particularly care about you, but they have information on millions of people. And so they can kind of use that information or buying habits for Amazon and kind of link it up to your buying habits and say, well, you bought these 3 things, Joe Schmo over here in Seattle bought the same 3 things, maybe you want the same 4th thing, what have you, right? In science, it's remaking the face of science, and that's why you're seeing all these sort of cover stories, Nature and Science and Economists talking about the data deluge. We almost have too much data to deal with. How do you handle it? How do you make sense of it? In the spatial realm, we've got ultra sense imagery. You've got literally billions and billions of records of data on people's habits because they carry, essentially carrying fancy spy equipment with you. If Congress had tried to pass a law 20 or 30 years ago mandating that everyone had a bug on them that can monitor their voice and track their location and all their buying habits and all their viewing habits, right? We freak out. That would never happen here in the US. But of course now we do it to ourselves, right? The cell phones are these magical devices, but they allow all sorts of data collection. So I've got students, for instance, who use tweets, right, and Twitter, these little blurbs of sort of text that people send out into the internet. And these often have a location attached to them. I think people don't know that very often. So, we have students who are using millions of geolocated tweets to sort of track flu or, all these sort of things. So we've got a number of, say, computer scientists on campus, like Vipin Kumar in his planetary skin project, taking vast amounts of satellite data, having it interpreted, often working with folks like Joe Knight and so on, into vegetation, and then saying, can we predict future vegetation as a function of climate change? You've got IonE fellow Shashi Shekhar and Arindam Banerjee doing sort of the same stuff, taking vast amounts of data, running it through sophisticated spatial thinking, spatial analysis algorithms to track and predict things like changing deserts or abrupt vegetation change in Africa, or trying to collect information and track global droughts right before they happen. So we're living in this era of big data. Another project on campus, the IonE, APC, and libraries working together with other folks on and off campus to create Terra Populus, which is going to be the largest curated human environment data set in the world. Basically, we're taking billions of records on population from census information, lots of aerial data, combining it with environmental data, smooshing it all together, right, coming up with new algorithms and so on to make it work, and making it available to literally thousands of researchers and public policymakers who want to have deep and sophisticated information on the human environmental condition in specific locations. Here at the IonE, you've got the Global Landscapes Initiative, or GLI, and you've got the Natural Capital Project, or NatCap. These are both groups that are interested in using big environmental data and human data to assess the state of the world. For GLI, it's about land use and food and so on. And then NatCap is interested in ecosystem services, how to forest provide clean water and that sort of stuff. And they truly are on the forefront of creating, say, projections into water availability, or GLI. This is their global stocks map. This is the most viewed map at the University of Minnesota right now. We have, 15,000 hits. The number up there is out of date. Right, so literally thousands of people are drawing these data down off the internet from a site that Spatial helped create. Another mapping project where Spatial played a little role in the sense of offering online mapping is you have a sort of a parcel here of IonE fellows, Jason Hill, Julian Marshall, and Dylan Millett, who are mapping pollution from space as well on the ground and then tying it to, say, economic impacts, public health impacts, and so on. And again, we're living in this age where we can draw in all this data, do sophisticated analysis, and make it available to whoever wants to see it out there, right? Which I think is a key mission for the IonE and the University of Minnesota. And then I want to end off just with a final few projects where I think of as sort of views on the ground, right? So much of what we do is sort of, big data and taking pictures from space and so on, but the work that we do locally and on the ground is just as valuable, in some ways more, depending on what you're doing. So here's where we worked again with folks in the School of Nursing as part of a class to create a web mapping application where students, one of these MOOCs, these very large online classes, where they could help crowdsource or contribute to a map that implements the World Health Organization, or WHO's age-friendly checklist, right? And this is the idea that a lot of our built infrastructure is not actually serving an Asian population particularly well. As folks get older, we have mobility and so on. And so here the students actually help create a data set and a map, right, that sort of tracked pro and con how we're providing services according to this checklist. You've got folks in public health. Michael Oakes, for instance, in the School of Public Health, is doing all sorts of wonderful work on sort of the environmental determinants of health and disease, harkening right back to John Snow. And he's particularly interested in how do we readjust or redo our samples so that they account for space better, right? Very often we sample populations, we ignore where they live, when we know that all sorts of diseases and syndromes and so on are tied to where you live and who you know, right? So he's doing work there. We have joint projects with, say, between CLA and the School of Public Health to track and project diseases like West Nile virus in Minnesota. A lot of our grand challenges seem to revolve around cities and communities, making them resilient and sustainable, equitable, just. There's plenty of folks here on campus using spatial thinking to address these issues. So you've got the Resilient Communities Project, which is a joint project between Cura and IonE, right, where you have teams using all sorts of mapping technologies and other things to help develop measures of resilience. Here we've got, it's actually a civil engineering class that was doing a project where they were tracking impervious surfaces, or those that don't soak up water, to help monitor where runoff would come from and where it would end up. You've got all sorts of great work happening at the Metropolitan Design Center run by Tom Fisher, and in the College of Design more broadly, where we have IonE fellow Laura Bisaccio, using various mapping technologies and sort of models to project how we can change our cities to make them more livable, have more green space, more walkability, and so on down the line. One fascinating study, Janae Brigham, working on a river journey. And this is where Spatial helped provide some underlying mapping technology to let students engage in an experiential education project where basically they were sort of tasked with finding out, well, what happens once you turn your tap off in your sink at school, where does that water go? Who does it impact? Where does it end up, right? So they have a whole series of what are called story maps, which let you have maps that tie together images and video and scientific findings and so on to kind of create this journey, right? And help sort of tack it to the ground. And just some final examples here related to this. I think often here at the U, we have these sometimes arbitrary distinctions between, say, research and teaching and service, right? But we all know that we become better teachers when we're active researchers. And increasingly, our students and members of the public are letting us become, or enabling us to become better researchers, right? Because we're pushing all this technology out. And so you've got IonE fellow Aaron Daring with his LT Media Lab, which is downstairs here, using all sorts of mapping technologies and GPS and other things to engage students and members in the public to sort of share their thoughts and learn more about, say, climate change processes and so on, right? So you're getting this sort of two-way flow. It's education, but it's research as well. Science on a Sphere, IonE fellow Pat Hamilton at the Science Museum in Minnesota has had a long-standing project called SOS, Science on a Sphere, and this is basically a big translucent globe with a special projector in it that lets you sort of create dynamic visualizations on the surface of the globe. And then you've got Kate Brauman, who's here in the back of the room, and then IonE fellow Tracy Twine taking their research and adapting it for SOS so they can share it more broadly. And then finally, one of my favorite examples, and I've been involved in this project for quite a while, is K-12 mapping, where the University of Minnesota partners with local schools and organizations to bring kids in from elementary and high school. This was a day we brought in 80 students, right, and their teachers, and we did a very short sort of workshop on how to use web mapping. And this is sort of pre-Google in a way. This one's actually a few years ago, and so we created all the underlying software and so on. We also expose them to real maps in the map libraries that don't completely track the path. And then these students go back into their communities and use these technologies to focus on issues that they find interesting. So we had one group that started to use maps to keep track of where graffiti was, where broken benches were, parks that had litter in them, and then actually went to the city council and said, look, we found all this junk, right? And that helped enact change, right? That's how, for so long, mapping and technology has often sort of been from the top down, right? This lets the bottom up happen. We had another example where students in the Horace Mann School wanted to have a voice in the redevelopment of the Ford plant location. This is a big plot of land in St. Paul they're redeveloping. And they created very sophisticated maps and land use projections for that to come up with different ideas, to have a voice as part of that process. So I'm going to leave it there. Simply put, I think spatial thinking is integral to dealing with any set of grand challenges this university has to address. I welcome questions now, and I also say if you ever want to get a hold of me and use Spatial, we have a single email address here, and then our website also has fairly good and up-to-date information. And I'll leave you with this. This is actually real. This is a fellow who about 20, 30 years ago cut down a forest in the shape of the state, and then when that forest regrew, cut down all the stuff around it to have this map that's been in place now for 30, 40 years, right? So it's not all serious all the time, right? All right, thank you very much.
Steve, a really quick question while I walk back here.
Absolutely.
You mentioned the 5 years of funding, and you're in the 5th year. I hope this resource is not going away, right?
Boy, you know, it's almost like I slipped this guy $20, right, before they started to ask the right questions. You know, I assumed the directorship just this year. Francis Harvey, who was the PI of the project, he's left the university. He had it for the first 4 years. So one thing we're learning very quickly now is we are experimenting with a number of different streams and plans for continuing this. I think there's so much interest in use Spatial that it sort of has to continue. But clearly we don't want to go back to the well of OVPR all the time. And so we're having multiple conversations with folks. So a little warning to faculty members in particular, I may be bugging you in the next little while to come with me and visit your dean, because we always love talking to our deans, especially when we're asking for money. And you know, and that'll be part of the picture, part of the puzzle. We're also doing a lot of grants work. We're also looking at an external sales organization where we get grants from, you know, companies and so on. So I'm hoping that we'll continue. We're doing our best.
Well, hi, thanks for a great talk. I think one of the things you said that was most exciting to me is just the update on Terra Populus. And I know you've had talks with us here at Institute on the Environment before, but a specific question came up in my head is, you mentioned that you're going to, the goal of this is to make all of the data very accessible to people. Are you going to be creating like an interface that would allow programmers to use it with tools such as the Natural Capital Project, what we use? Specifically, I'm thinking of, would it be possible to use Terra Populus and access it through some sort of API?
Yeah, that's the plan right now. An API is what's called an application programmers interface. It's sort of code that lets people, say, from across the web access the data directly. So yeah, we're working on that right now. It's sometimes a little tricky because some of the data have privacy restrictions attached to them. But once we figure that out, yeah, the idea is that for, you know, sort of Joe public, they can simply go to the website and download what they want. But for folks who want more direct access, yeah, it'll be like a pipeline right there.
Thank you, Steve.
Sure.
Say, I noticed your images are almost all bigger than human. They're campus level, they're state level, nation level, continent level.
Mm-hmm.
You also mentioned the bio areas are big into spatial analytics, and I've seen this in the past too. So I can imagine two applications, one being like disease spread across an area that's bigger than human, but also I can imagine like 3D analysis of what's going on inside the body.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So what is the big deal with the bio area? What is the major area of investigation of spatial?
Oh, there's almost too many. I think two within the bio that are fascinating is you know, this notion of the microbiome, right? And this is all the critters. You know, we have billions and billions upon billions of bacteria in our bodies and so on, right? And all sorts of other critters. And there's a lot of interest in that. And I think at first it was seen as exclusively like what's happening in your gut, you know, or it was this study that just came out where they sampled like your eyes and your armpits and all this stuff, and all these little microbiomes. But it turns out there's an environmental component to that as well. So a lot of this work now is, say, using the human body as an entry point, but then quickly scaling up to who's in your house and your family and your neighborhood and so on. And so there's a lot of cross-scalar work going on. I think there's this work on the connectome, right? And this is all this money going to NIH and so on for brain research, where they're trying to track all the various connections and so on. And it turns out there's a lot of similarities, you know, whether you're looking at the distribution of stars, or you know, bears in the landscape, or the way the connections are formed in the brain. You can actually use a lot of the same underlying spatial algorithms, right? And say our computer science folks, they do a lot of this work where they're good at developing generic approaches to spatial entities, and then they're happy to apply to almost any scale. I think one third one, I'll just throw this in, say anyone who's got like an iPhone, for instance, probably got an update recently where they have this sort of Apple Health thing kind of thrust upon you in a way it's very get rid of. Using health monitoring in your phone and then using these Fitbits. I'm sure there's a number of people here that have these watches that basically track things like their heart rate, the number of times they're taking steps and so on. I think there's a lot of interest there at the intersection of, say, computer science and the built environment and public health, trying to track how your daily interactions and movements and so on interact with the broader environment, both social and environmental. So yeah, there's tons of stuff going on. And I'll be honest, I look with the health work, half of our new contacts in the last year at New Spatial have been with health providers and professionals, because in some ways they were there at the start of the spatial analysis, but in some ways they're kind of playing catch up with a lot of the systems and so on. Anyway, that was a very long answer. Yes, that is where it's happening. You are correct.
Professor, thank you for giving today. I am a research assistant working here in IonE. I'm quite interested in the database management problem here, because if you are dealing with spatial computing, basically you're dealing with gillions of data. So as your project is the size of the project growing bigger and bigger, so how do you deal with that data management problems? Because if I want to get access to a map which contains like several gigabytes of data, and probably it would take hours for me to make a simple change.
Yeah.
How is there any efficient solutions to those problems, or what kind of database management systems do you use?
No, it's an excellent question. I'll be honest. Like the technical term is it's a pain in the ass. Yeah, I'm on about a half dozen projects right now, and several of which are here at the IonE, and this seems to be confounding pretty much everyone right now. There's no good solution that sort of works across the board. The spatial big data thing, people are very excited about it, but we just have a weird mix of open source and proprietary software. Some companies like Google have sort of, cracked certain problems, so for the Google mapping and so on, but A, that work isn't broadly available, or B, it's very specific to particular types of data. I will say that if you are doing work on this is the place to do it. University of Minnesota, no lie, is probably one of the top 3 universities in the entire world dealing with spatial topics. We were one of the originators of a lot of the early systems going back to the 60s here. Minnesota's always been known as having very robust data collections and so on. And now I can look at the work that's going on here with, say, GLI and NatCab, as well as, say, in computer science. You got 4 or 5 folks over there. You got Vipin Kumar, Shashi Shekhar, Banerjee, Mohammed Mokbel, Brent Hecht, Jaideep Savastra, Victoria Durante. I could go on and on trying to deal with this. And so Mohammed Mokbel, for instance, has created a new system that uses different new kinds of databases to handle big spatial problems. That said, there's a reason why all the federal agencies are dumping so much money into this, because there are no good single solutions. So in the short term, you should definitely talk to us. And I think you've come into the existing conversations we're having in IonE, but you would make the lives of a lot of people better if you could solve that problem. So, are you a PhD student? Are you a PhD student or postdoc? Oh, then you got plenty of time. Just make that your dissertation. Solve all the big spatial big data problems right there. Couple months.
I have a quick question for you. There's a question from the audience. Be thinking of your next question. This isn't a question that's a challenge for you, Spatial. I'm sure it's a challenge that's much bigger than that. But you mentioned the resolution and how fine it's becoming nowadays. Are you running into issues around privacy? Is that something that you're seeing come up more and more? Just curious about that.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. It's amazing how much information there is on this, right? For instance, like the court system is sort of woefully out of date. I'm married to a lawyer, so I'm allowed to say that. The amount of data you can collect, using a drone, for instance, is vast, right? There's all sorts of court cases around that. Like I said, with the cell phones, there's all sorts of tracking going on there. I think what makes it tricky is that, the courts are kind of out of date. The legislative side of things doesn't necessarily want to mess with it unless something really bad happens. And then, of course, the private sector loves it, right? And these are well-meaning people, don't get me wrong, but this is what all the money is. So I think it's going to take more high-profile events. Say one unfortunate example is, the use of sort of stalking software. So there's laws against that now, right? But it's very easy to track people, track many, many people. And I guess what I really worry about is also just large-scale surveillance. I've got a stepbrother who's been very worried about, government spying on him and so on. And I always thought he was a little crazy. He's like, no one's spying on you, okay, just relax. And then we have all these revelations, right, about the NSA, and it turns out that actually all these companies are absolutely tracking you. iPhone's got dinged for that. They're tracking, in real time and making the data available. And of course, the government is as well. And I thought, well, they wouldn't care about you. Well, they don't really, but they care about everyone, so you're going to get grabbed up in that. So yeah, it's a mess, I think. I hate to say it, all my questions are going to end up with the answers like, yeah, it's a mess. We're talking about it. Which makes it fun.
Do you have other questions from the audience?
So I'll give you one more question. It's going to be the same answer.
Sure, going to be a mess.
So spatial data position is super cool. Have you thought too much about the next step of thinking about movement through space?
Yeah, this is a hot topic right now as well. Yeah, it's this whole notion of mobility in space. Because for stuff that doesn't move very much, you kind of have it figured out. There's a tremendous amount of interest in, say, again, using personal tracking. I had a student who was dealing with this notion of food deserts, right? This is this readily accepted policy idea that, in order to give people better food choices, we need to just simply, dump Whole Foods in areas where there are no grocery stores already, right? And then the problem is solved, and you take care of all sorts of, public health issues and so on. So I had a student who actually had folks carry GPS trackers on them, and use that to create a log. And it turns out that people will travel miles and miles to get a certain type of shopping experience. Or, there was one lady who liked to go to this one new place and so on. So it'd make no difference if there was a new food store right there. People will find a way. So you're seeing an explosion in these kind of studies. You're seeing with animals, they can have trackers now in sharks, right? And they'll track these sharks traveling for thousands of miles. They're getting trackers that are getting smaller and smaller, so you put in, very small creatures. So, ecology's breaking open right now, so you can actually track animals. So, and then, but again, though, you run into this issue: how do you store and use these data? I had a student work on airplane noise. He had several million airplane flights and then noise data attached to them, and he wanted to kind of track how it's affecting people. A couple of years ago, it was a big thing in the news where people were complaining about all the airplane noise. And there was just no software that did it properly, right? So you had to kind of cobble stuff together for his dissertation. So it's exciting, but what? It's a mess.
One last question then for Steve before we wrap up here today. Make my way back up to front. Where is this all going? Where is big mapping headed next? What's the frontier that's coming up that you're excited about?
Wow, that is the question. I think the data is getting out there, getting even further out of silos, making it readily available to everyone, researchers, students, policymakers, what have you. And then having that be cause for discussion. So one tiny little anecdote, and I'll be quiet, I promise. I was in a meeting the other day with computer scientists. It's like a bad joke, there's no punchline. So I'm in a meeting, should have walked into a bar, granted. Computer scientists, an economist, an ecologist, physicist, myself. And it's funny, we spent about half an hour, talking about this project we had planned. It's fascinating stuff. But I was sort of amazed at some of the similarities between how different disciplines handled space, but using completely different terms and languages. It's like, wait a minute, we do that too, right? But then there are other things I'm like, that sounds crazy. Tell me more about that. And I think that sort of the access to the data combined with greater integration, whether it's policymakers or researchers, what have you, that's going to be the next step, I think. At least personally, I think happening here on campus. Very excited by it.
My prediction is that we're going to have a migration to the new batch of cookies and stuff that came out. So.
Is there time for one more?
Yeah, sure, we got time for one more. Sure.
This is on?
Yep.
This
Yeah.
just struck me after all questions were closed. But, so, one of the things we did is a spatial project where we took all the weather stations of the United States and looked at the historical weather data for a century and watched the climate flow across the land. Weather flows across the land.
Yeah.
Climate does too, just much more slowly. And in the last 20 years, climate has been flowing north in Minnesota. They have been sloshing east and west first, but now it struck me. And is this possible yet? Since we get very good resolution, and if we can get this in color, if we can get a picture of the globe, or at least of the United States, or someplace, where we can, at successive intervals, especially a few times in spring and a few times in fall, each tree changes its color, each species of tree changes its color differently. You can't identify species of trees there, but you can as you watch their color change in spring and fall.
Right.
Are we at the stage where we could track every tree in the country and watch it over the course of 10 years? Now we will see some very serious climate change things that would be actual results rather than just what I was doing. What is the weather doing? We see what the ecological results.
Right.
Are we at that point of being able to hit individual trees? We could from an airplane, of course, but
Yeah.
can we from satellites yet, where it become cheap enough and feasible?
All right, and with the key caveat that I'm probably gonna get yelled at by my
With
colleagues. With the key caveat that I'm probably gonna be yelled at and get some angry emails after this. I think the answer is tentatively yes, in the sense that you have the data. Maybe not back 10 years. Some of these more recent data sets are literally just a couple years.
Start now and go forward.
Yeah,
That's
start now
fine.
and go forward.
Yeah.
It's amazing the work they're doing in, say, forest resources right now, using what's called optic recognition to pick out, individual trees in the landscape out of a large panorama. And then, once you have that information, it'd be, pretty easy to create the model and visualize it and so on. And so,
All I need is a sub-tree pixel by color. That's all I need.
pretty much,
That's all I need.
which
And
is,
over
there's,
the course of time.
and there's phenology we have to worry about, like the stages where the plants grow.
Right,
and
that's
so
what
on.
I'd be
So,
watching, the phenology.
Yeah,
And then
you
I
could
did-
definitely get started on it.
Also, you can find this way sick trees. I already found this out from aerial photos. You can identify the species by color, and you can find sick trees
Yeah.
from aerial photos. Now I want to do it from satellites.
Yeah, and that's where most of it's going, absolutely. Like, the local governments used to spend 70, 100K on these overflights for aerial photos, and
Yeah.
now that's being replaced
That's-
mostly by space.
So with
and
a few
drones.
100 trillion bytes of data, I can do it for the world.
Tentatively, yes. I'm gonna let Len handle that one, though. Just email that guy right there, and we'll push it on through. Absolutely. Thanks, Glenn.
All right, well, please join me in thanking Steve for a fascinating talk.